All right, welcome to Social Psychology Week 3. Today we're going to be talking about beliefs and judgments. We're going to go through and spend some time talking about priming, a little bit on heuristics and heuristic processing, and then towards the end we'll talk about this in terms of social thinking and memories. So to start with, we're going to do a little exercise. What I'd like you to do is read the words that you see on the screen and then write down in your notes the category to which you think these words belong. Just give you a minute to do that. Go ahead, read the words and write down the category to which you think these words belong. All right, so next what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly show you an image, and your job is to take a look at the image and then write down what you see. You ready? 3, 2, 1. Okay, what did you see? Go ahead and write it down. All right, what did you see? Go ahead and write it down. Now, most of you, I'm going to predict, saw an old man. Let's go back to that image for a second. So if we take a look at this image, we imagine that these are the eyes, and this is the nose, this is sort of the chin here, this is an ear. Sort of see an image of an old man. Now, when I do this demonstration in my face-to-face classes, I will sort of play a little trick on my students, and half of them will get these word categories: old, familiar, bald man, nose. Right? All of these sort of belong to this category of elderly. Half of my students will get that. The other half of my students will get words like elephant, dog, fish, cat, and those words belong to the category of animal. Now, what's interesting about this is that for the students who get the elderly related categories, that typically leads them to see this image as an old man, as I'm sure many of you probably experienced when you were watching this video. But what's interesting is for students who get the animal related words in the animal category, they actually tend to see this image differently, and you might already see this already. They tend to see this as a mouse. What this is the eye of the mouse, and these are the ears. This is the back legs of the mouse, and this is sort of the back and the tail. Right? So what's interesting about this is that that information about the words and the category biased your perception of this image. And this is an example of what we call priming. Here's another example. Let's say I give you this word, flowing water, and I ask you this question. The couple stood by the bank. Where are they? Now, for most of you, you're going to say a river, right? Because the idea of flowing water is closely associated with the idea of a river. And when I ask you this question, they stood by the bank, you interpret the bank to be a riverbank, right? So they're at the river. And again, in the discussion this week, I'm sure many students will say, no, that didn't happen for me, but this happens for most people. Now, the interesting thing is, what if I'd given you a different word? What if I'd said cash flow? The couple stood by the bank. Now where are they? Right? The words cash flow are associated with money, and money is associated with financial banks. Right? And so you get a completely different picture, interpretation of what that word bank meant based on the information that I'm giving you beforehand. Right? And this is an example of priming. Right? You can think of our memory system as this sort of web of associations. If I say to you, zoo. If I say to you, think of all the things that come to mind when I say the word zoo. You know, many of you might say zebras or elephants or giraffes or popcorn, or zoos smell bad, right? Rhinoceroses stink, that kind of thing, right? All of those things are associated in your memory. In your physical brain, there are neural connections between those ideas of animals and the idea of a zoo. And what's interesting about our memory system is that if you activate one of those ideas, if I say the word zebra to you, then all of the things in your brain that are attached to the word zebra, that are associated with the word zebra, sort of warm up a little bit. They don't automatically come flooding into your conscious awareness, right? but your brain just kind of warms up those ideas in case you need it, right? Because your brain says, well, if I'm thinking about zebras, then I might need to tell that story about the time I was at the zoo, or I might need to, talk about what I know about zebras. And so all of that information gets warmed up at the unconscious level. Okay? And this idea of activating these associations is called priming, right? Essentially what we do is we're warming up these ideas in your brain, and that has the potential to bias your social perception. So there's a famous study, you guys remember John Barge from last time with the hot and cold study. He did another study where he primed people with words related to the elderly stereotype. So he brought them into the lab and he exposed them to information about this sort of elderly stereotype. And then as part of the study, he said, okay, now we're done with this part of the study. And what I want you to do is take your folder, take your file down the hall, and give it to the receptionist at the end of the hall. And what they did was they timed the amount of time it took people to walk from the room to the receptionist. And what they found was that the people in the elderly prime conditions, so the people who had the concept of elderly sort of warmed up in their brain, primed, they walked slower down the hallway, physically slower, compared to people who were in a control condition, right, who weren't primed with anything. And so what's interesting is that priming can have this sort of profound impact on the way that we perceive the world. And this can happen outside of our conscious awareness, right? We're not necessarily, the people in the John Barge study were not aware that they were walking any slower than maybe they normally do or than other people. But the idea, the concept of elderly influenced their behavior nonetheless. Now, priming works because we use mental shortcuts as a way of quickly and efficiently processing social information. Priming is one way that we can sort of quickly and efficiently process social information. And heuristics are another way. Heuristics, the definition of a heuristic are mental shortcuts. They allow us to make decisions without consuming mental resources. Now, you can think of these as sort of snap judgments. Generally, they're very helpful. They make our lives easier. So, for example, many people are afraid of snakes. And this is based on our evolutionary past, where snakes are dangerous. They have the potential to kill you. And most of us are not snake experts, so we don't know which ones are dangerous and which ones aren't. So we have this sort of heuristic that we just stay away from snakes, right? And this makes our life easy. We don't have to spend time thinking about, is this a poisonous snake or is this not a poisonous snake? We just can leave all the snakes alone. Okay? And this is an example of this sort of mental shortcut. But there are problems with these heuristics because when we apply these kinds of overall rules, we're not always right, and this can sometimes lead to biases. So one example of a bias is what we call the anchor and adjust heuristic. And this is when someone uses a value as a starting point and then adjusts from this number. So I'll give you two examples of this. So think about The Price is Right. Many people watch The Price is Right. It used to be one of the things that I enjoyed about staying home from school when I was a kid. Now, typically, if you're not familiar with The Price is Right, contestants are shown a series of items, and then they're asked to estimate the cost or the value of those items. And they're asked to do it usually one at a time. And what will happen is the first person, right, they're estimating based on their own information, right? There's no information about the price. They're estimating based on what they know. And so let's say this first person estimates, well, this prize package is worth $500. Now what happens after this is all of these other people now have this price point of $500. And that's an additional piece of information that they didn't have before. And now what they're doing is they're saying, okay, $500. Do I think that this package is worth more than that? Or do I think it's worth less than that? And so someone might say, well, this woman says $5.99. I think it's worth a little bit more. This person says $4.25. I think it's probably a little bit less. And then, of course, if you're that one person who thinks that, if you're that one person who thinks that it's going to be less than $4.25, then of course you're going to bid $1 just because that's how The Price is Right goes. But this is an example of this anchor and adjust. right? That $500 becomes an anchor, and then people adjust based on that. Now, that first woman could have been wildly off, and if you watch The Price is Right, this oftentimes happens, right? But people will still use that anchor point and then adjust away from it. We also see this in car sales. So the MSRP, the manufacturer suggested retail price on a car, is meant to be, it's designed to be an anchor, right? It's designed to be a point that says this is what the car is worth, and the dealer, their goal is to try and get you to adjust up from that anchor, right? But what's interesting about the MSRP is that even if you get the car for the MSRP, all of the profits for the dealer and the dealership, that's all built into that MSRP. So really, as a savvy car buyer, your goal should be to adjust down from the MSRP. But again, this is anchor and adjust, using this number as a starting value and then adjusting from that. Here's another interesting heuristic processing. So this is another one of those in-class online activities. So I'm going to give you a list of cities, and what I want you to do is just write down briefly in your notes which city is bigger. Which city do you think has the larger population? So Rio de Janeiro or Karachi, which is in Pakistan. Dhaka or Baghdad. And again, you're writing down which one you think has the larger population. Los Angeles or Tehran. Lagos or Berlin, Madrid or Kinshasa, Chicago or Lahore, St. Petersburg or Rome, Wuhan and Paris, Alexandria and Houston, and San Diego and Lunada. So go ahead and just make sure you write down for each of these two pairs which one you think is going to have the larger population. All right, once you've got those all written down, you can proceed in the video. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the answers. And what I want you to do is mark how many that you got correct. So Karachi is twice as big as Rio. Dhaka is twice as big as Baghdad. Tehran is twice as big as Los Angeles. Lagos is twice as big as Berlin. Kinshasa is twice as big as Madrid. Lahore is bigger than Chicago. St. Petersburg bigger than Rome. Wuhan bigger than Paris. Alexandria is bigger than Houston. And Luanda is bigger than San Diego. Now mark how many you got correct. Now based on my experience of doing this face-to-face classes, typically students end up getting one or two of these correct. There's 10 possible pairs, and usually students end up getting one or two correct. So the question becomes, and as I'm sure you've sort of seen, you probably got a lot of it wrong as well, why is that people are indicating the wrong city? Why is that happening? And this has to do with what we call the availability heuristic, right? We tend to overestimate the frequency of events by how easily they come to mind. Right? We tend to overestimate the population of our city, Chicago, because we can think about how big the city of Chicago is. Right? Most of us have probably never been to Lahore, Pakistan. We have no idea what that city is like. Right? But we know that Chicago is big, so given that choice, right, we're going to go with what we know, the available information. Right? This tendency to overestimate the frequency of events by how easily they come to mind. This can also influence perceptions of people, influence perceptions of behavior, influence perceptions of world events, right? If I ask people right now how likely it is that you think Malaysian Airlines is going to suffer a fatal plane accident in the near future, most people would probably say that that's very likely to happen because recently one Malaysian airline was lost at sea and another one was shot down over Ukraine. And so those are highly available ideas, right? We can think of those very easily. And if we can think of it easily, then we think it's likely to happen. So here's another example. This is another one of those. Go ahead and write down in your notes. Which one do you think is the most common cause of death in the United States? Car accidents or cancer of the digestive system? All accidents or strokes? And all accidents means like falling off a ladder and car accidents. Murder or diabetes, drowning or leukemia, floods or hepatitis, tornadoes or asthma. Now, if you've started to catch on to how this works, I bet you've started to notice that the one you think is probably the most likely cause of death is actually not, right? So all of these are more likely causes of death. You are 5 times more likely to die in a tornado or of asthma than in a tornado. 3 times more likely to die of leukemia than to drown. But most of the time, people don't think about these things this way. And part of the reason here is this availability heuristic. We hear stories about murder on the news. We hear stories about people dying in car accidents on the news, especially in Chicago, all the time, right? These news stories are full of these dramatic events, but they're not full of the non-dramatic someone died of a stroke, right? And so because it's easy to think about stories about people who died in car accidents, we overestimate the likelihood that that's going to happen. And in general, we tend to be insensitive to numerical or statistical information. We tend to rely on our intuitive judgments and anecdotal evidence rather than objective base rates. So one example is that people in the United States are 9 or 10 times more likely to die from a bee sting than from a shark attack. But if you ask people, especially if there's been a shark attack on the news, sort of conflate base rate fallacy and availability heuristic, people will say that sharks are much more dangerous than bees, which seems true, but that ignores this numerical information that bee stings are significantly more likely to cause harm than shark attacks. The other side to that is this idea of the representativeness heuristic. Right? Events that are more representative are regarded as more probable, right? We perceive sharks to be dangerous, right? And so sharks are representative of this idea of danger, and so they seem more dangerous to us than bees. Here's another example of this. So Colin is very tall and muscular. He's very competitive. He drives an expensive car and wears flashy clothing. What is more likely? That Colin is a professional athlete, or that Colin is either a lawyer or a financial analyst. Now, when I do this in class, most students will say, well, it's much more likely that he's a professional athlete. But there's a problem here, right? This is the representativeness heuristic in action. We think of athletes as being muscular. We think of them as being competitive and being flashy and fancy, right? So because Colin fits our idea of what a professional athlete is, we overestimate the likelihood that he is actually an athlete. When you take and you count up the number of professional athletes in the United States, and you compare that to the number of lawyers or financial analysts, the number of lawyers and financial analysts vastly dwarfs the number of professional athletes. So if we were just picking at random, without any information, odds are Colin is going to be a lawyer or an analyst, just because there are so many more of them. But we use that representative heuristic, right? It looks like a duck, therefore it must be a duck, right? He seems to us like a professional athlete, so that must be more likely, even though the probability of that is so low. So he conforms to this stereotype, right? And this is what I just said. Another thing that influences our social judgments is framing, the way that information is presented. Specifically, we can talk about framing things in terms of gains or losses. People are much more upset when they lose $20 compared to how happy they would be if they found $40. Right? People are very sensitive to losses, and we feel losses much stronger than we feel potential gains. So for example, if I ask students, and I do this in class, I said, imagine that you're the president, and there's an epidemic called Ebola that we know is going to kill 600 people. And the president has 2 options. She can either go with program A, which is going to guarantee to save 200 people, or she can go with program B. Now with program B, that's a little risky. There's a third of a chance that she's going to save all 600, and 2/3 of a chance that she's going to save no one. So if I give you this, so write down which program do you think you would choose. Would you choose program A or program B? For scenario 1. Now we're going to go through and we're going to do this again. I'm going to ask the same question, but we're going to ask it in a slightly different way. So you're still the president. You still know that there's an epidemic that's going to kill 600 people. But in program A, you're guaranteed that 400 people are going to die. And in program B, there's 1/3 of a chance that no one will die and 2/3 of a chance that all 600 people will die. Now, which program are you willing to go for? Program A or program B? Now, typically when I do this in my face-to-face classes, what we find is that for scenario 1, people are much more likely to choose program A than program B. And the reason for this is that this program is framed in terms of gains. Right? You'll notice that mathematically, these two programs are exactly the same. For scenario 1, 200 people are going to live, 400 people are going to die. Right? The same thing is true for program B in scenario 1. 1/3 chance of saving everyone, 2/3 chance of everyone dying. Right? They're exactly the same, but people flip depending on how it's framed. When the programs are framed in terms of gains, 200 people being saved, people are more likely to choose program A. When the program is framed in terms of losses, 400 people are gonna die, people are more likely to choose program B because program B seems like less of a risk. So framing really matters. How we present information, again, the same exact information numerically, but how we present that influences the way that people perceive that information. And this highlights one of the themes that runs through social psychology, is that perceptions of reality are much more important than the objective reality. Right? Essentially, what is going on here is that people don't like losses. Right? In scenario 1, program B seems like a bigger loss, and in scenario 2, program A seems like a bigger loss. All right, so the last thing that we're going to talk about today is about constructing memories and how memory works briefly. So what I want you to do is go ahead and just read this story, and we'll get back to this in a minute. So imagine you go to a fancy restaurant for dinner. The hostess seats you at a table with a white tablecloth, and you tell the server that you want the prime rib, medium rare with a baked potato, and a salad with Italian dressing. You order some wine from the wine list. Later, the server arrives with your salsa, and then the rest of it, that should say salad, and then the rest of your meal. You enjoy it all, but the prime rib is a bit overdone. The end. Now, when we talk about memories, and we talk about social memories, many students sort of think about memory the same way that they think about the files on their computer, right? You have an experience. It's kind of like your video. You save that video onto your phone or onto your computer. And when you want to watch that video later, you open it back up and it just sort of replays for you. But memory doesn't really work like that. Memory doesn't work the way like a video recorder or a tape recorder. The way that we understand that memory gets stored is if you imagine that for any particular experience that you're having, sitting here listening to me talk on this video, there is a pattern of neurological activity that is unique. There's something unique about that pattern of neurological activity in your brain, your whole brain, the overall pattern, that's unique to this moment, this experience. Now, in a week, or when you are working on the quiz and you're trying to remember what I talked about in the lecture for this week, and you're trying to remember that, what is happening is your brain is actually recreating that unique pattern of neural activity that existed at the time of the event. So it's literally recreating the neurological state that your brain was in. Now you know that you're not having that whole experience all over again because all of your sensory systems are telling you that it's a different place and a different time. Right? But when you're remembering, you're actually recreating this activity. And we know this because of a couple of interesting studies, and we can talk about this rat study. So if you recall classical conditioning from intro psych, classical conditioning is when you repeatedly pair a stimulus with an unconditioned response, and then the stimulus itself will produce that response. So if you put a rat in a little cage with an electrified floor, not like electrified to like really hurt the rat, but just kind of like that static shock that you get from your friend that kind of is uncomfortable. And every time you play a little tone, you just make a little boop, then you hit a button and it shocks the rat. And again, think of it like a little static shock. Right? It's really uncomfortable. The rat doesn't like it. And after a while, the rat learns that if I hear that sound, they tense up. They know that shock is coming. Now, what's interesting is that if you give the rat a couple drugs that disrupt disrupt their brains from creating these memories, from solidifying these memories, you can actually prevent this conditioned response from happening. So if you give them this drug and you go tone, shock, tone, shock, tone, shock over and over again, they never learn that the tone will lead to a shock. In other words, they never remember, they never create that memory in the first place. Now, that's interesting, sure. Here's what's kind of messed up about this, though. If you take a rat and you classically condition them, so no drugs, you just tone, shock, tone, shock. So now they know, they've learned that the tone means a shock, right? And then you give that drug at the exact moment that you play that tone, you can actually erase that conditioned response. In other words, what this means is that because memory is an act of recreation, because when the rat hears that tone, their brain is recreating that experience that they had of getting shocked immediately after that tone. And when we give the rat a drug that disrupts that process, we can essentially erase that memory, right? Because we can change that pattern, right? And there's some pretty heavy implications with this, right? The more often you remember something, the more likely you are to revise that memory, to contaminate that memory, to change that memory to suit your particular goals. Right? So they do studies with married couples, and they ask them about the quality of their relationship. And then they come back and they talk to them again a few years later and ask them about the quality of the relationship again. And what they find is that for couples who are in trouble, couples who are not doing really well in their relationship, they're having, trouble with their relationship, they remember their relationship as being much worse than it actually was in the past. So can we sort of revise these memories backwards? It's also, one of the implications of this idea is that it might be possible to actually erase memories, which is kind of a ethically questionable idea. We could spend some time talking about that. So let's go back to that story we read. You guys remember when you went to the restaurant and you had the prime rib? So I'm going to ask a couple questions. I want you to just go ahead and write down your answers in your notes, and then I'll reveal the answers and we'll see. What kind of salad dressing did you order? Let's go ahead and write that down. Obviously, don't look back. I mean, you could, but it's fun to do it this way. Was the tablecloth red? What did you order to drink? And did the hostess or the server give you your menu? So go ahead and write down your answers. And then we'll go through and we'll reveal them. So, what kind of salad dressing did you order? Everyone would say Italian. The tablecloth was white, and you had wine to drink. Did the hostess or the server give you your menu? And this is a trick question. Neither of them gave you the menu. Okay. Didn't say. But when I do this in my face-to-face classes, and I'm sure some of you experience, when I ask this question, you think back and you probably said the hostess gave you the menu. Right? And the reason for this is that in our experience of going out to eat, this is typically what happens. So even though it says nothing about the hostess or the server, it doesn't say anything about menus at all in that story, we remember that the hostess was the one who did it, not because that's what actually happened, but that's because that's what we expected to happen, or because that's what typically happens, right? So it illustrates this idea that memory is sort of flexible and can be biased. Okay. So here's another implication for eyewitness testimony. So there was an experiment done by Elizabeth Loftus back in the early 90s. And she was interested in this idea of how language influences social perception. So she brought participants into her lab, and she divided them up into two groups. The first group watched a video of a car crash, and after that video, she asked these participants, how fast do you think the car was going when it bumped into the other car? Now, the other group watched the same exact video of a car crash, and she asked that group, how fast do you think that car was going when it smashed into the other car? So the only difference between the two groups is this word smashed or bumped, right? Both groups watched the same video, but what she found was that the group that was asked about how fast the car was going when it smashed evaluated the speed of the car significantly faster than the bumped, right? Than the participants who were asked how fast was it going when it bumped. Now, what's interesting about this is that they both saw the same exact video, but the words that they were asked, the questions that were asked of them, biased how they perceived and remembered that event, right? And we can talk about this as being this misinformation effect, right? If memories are recreated every time we think about them, then they are subject to incorporating false information, right? So if an eyewitness sees a car speeding away from the scene of the crime and the police officer says, you know, what color was the car that sped away? And the witness says, well, I'm not exactly sure. It all happened so fast. And then the police officer says, was it a red car? And the person says, well, I don't know. Are you sure it wasn't a red car? And then the witness says, yeah, I think it was a red car. And then all of a sudden, the witness has incorporated this information into their memory of the event. To them, when they think back and they see that experience, when they see that event in their minds, they see a red car, even though the car might have been blue or black or something else. Right? So this is really problematic for social perception. I'll give you one last study that's pretty messed up. So to push this to the boundaries, Wade et al. 2002 actually got students to bring in family photos as part of the study. So imagine it's the beginning of the semester and your assignment is to bring in as many family photos as you can for this research study and have your parents contribute some photos as well. And then what they did was they digitally altered a photo. So they photoshopped these participants' families out of one scene and into another scene at a hot air balloon. As the participant was a kid at the time. Right, so you can imagine that the participant is one of these sort of young people sort of hanging out in this hot air balloon. Completely fabricated this photo. And then they brought the participants back into the lab and they had them look at these photos and they asked them questions about them. And then one of the questions they asked is, tell me about this time when your family took a hot air balloon ride. Now this clearly never happened. It was Photoshopped. But what's interesting is that participants couldn't recall this happening, but they had this photo right in front of them. So they invented a memory to go with the photo. I don't remember this, but here's this picture, so it must have happened. Oh yeah, I do kind of remember, and it was a windy day, and I was cold, and but we had a lot of fun, and this kind of thing. So it is possible for these memories to be completely fabricated and implanted, which is again problematic for social perception. So that's it for the lecture for this week. We're going to watch a video for this week's discussion. And what I want you to do, and I'll put this in the instructions for discussion, but watch the video and then, make some connections, tie it to what we've learned about with remembering is recreating, problems with eyewitness testimony, but also to make some connections between representativeness, make some connections between some of these other bias processes that we've talked about over the last couple of weeks.